Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for those that are on the webinar already. We're just going to wait maybe 30 more seconds and then get started. All right, thanks everybody for joining us today for this webinar on flowcharts for small-scale producers' value-added processing. I'm going to take a few moments to explain some webinar software details. You should have a control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you enlarge the chat function on the bottom right, if you click that little triangle, you'll be able to see a box. And I just typed in a few moments ago a phone number for some reason you can see the screen right now, but you can't hear us. You can call that number and we can do our best to troubleshoot what your issue is. And then also important logistical item is in the handout part of the right-hand bar. If you expand that, there's two PDFs in there. One of those is the webinar 060518 file is the PDF of all these slides we're going to go over today. And then the PDF, the final value-added products 8.5 by 11 is the flow chart that we're going to go over today, the actual full file of it. And it's also available publicly on our website and UC Davis's as well in the near future. So we will be, and we will be emailing these out to everybody after the webinar. So there's those two details. And then if you have any questions along the way as we're presenting, please feel free to type your question into the chat box. If it's a quick question that's more to clarify something, we'll address it probably in the moment. But if it's a more in-depth question, we're going to save all those till the end, and we'll have plenty of question and answer time at the end. So without further ado, let's get started here. So my name is Kaylee Fireisel, and I'm the Food Safety Specialist at Community Alliance with Family Farmers. And I am an organic farmer and also work in the food safety space to help growers across the state get into compliance with applicable state and federal laws for mainly fresh produce, but we're trying to provide more resources for value-added and minimally processed products as well. And I am excited today to be joined by my colleague, Erin DiCaprio, and I'll let her say a few words.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Kaylee. I'm Erin DiCaprio. I'm an assistant specialist in cooperative extension in the Food Science and Technology Department at UC Davis. So my position is very focused on community food safety issues. My background's in microbiology. I'm very familiar with food regulations and the process of hazard analysis. So I'm very excited to be here today and talk you through these resources that we've developed to kind of help navigate the complexities of the food regulation environment for small food processors.
All right, so that's a little bit about us. We want to get a sense of folks on the webinar today. So we have a couple poll questions that we're going to send out to you right now. So I'm activating this. You should see, well, first I need to advance the slide. And so with these poll questions, we're asking about your current knowledge level on a few different topics. So if this is the first time you're hearing about this topic, your knowledge level is probably low. If you've heard a little bit or know a few things, you can see the scale here. Please just give it a quick rate. So I'm gonna launch the first poll, and it is, please rate your current knowledge level on the requirements for the California cottage food operation permit. All right, a couple more seconds. Thanks for voting. Okay, I'm gonna jump to the next poll. So there's a few different regulatory permits we're just gonna ask about to kind of get a sense of the start. So there's another permit called the California Processed Food Registration Permit. And how would you rate your current knowledge on this permit? All right, great. Thanks again for your participation. We just have 2 more of these. Thanks for doing this really quick. So the next one is, please rate your current knowledge level on the requirements for the California-based cannery license. Great, thank you very much. And then this last one here at the start is, please rate your current knowledge level on the requirements for the Food Safety Modernization Act Preventative Controls Rule. Fantastic, all right. Thank you, folks, for rating yourself on those. We're gonna continue on and talk about these now. So first, a thank you to our funders. The webinar today is brought to you all through a USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture Food Safety Outreach Grant, and the resource, the flowchart, the time and effort that went into that and the printing is provided through the Western Regional Center to enhance food safety. So thank you to our funders for your support of this.
All right, so I'm going to get us started, really getting into the nitty-gritty of these flowcharts and some of the regulations. And so kind of, I guess, the background behind why we found value in developing this type of resource is that many small processors are now entering the market with processing foods they're able to source locally from growers in their own regions. And so if you haven't learned yet, I'm sure you will as you start your food processing business, that the financial and regulatory hurdles that you have to go through to start your food business are rather large. So we aim to develop some easy to use resources that could help farmers or other small food processors really navigate the different state and federal regulatory requirements that are out there for if you're going to be processing and selling processed foods in the state of California.
So we have a couple more audience questions, but these are a little bit funner. So I'm gonna activate the first one here and ask the audience, do you have at least one product currently in production under the Cottage Food Law? Excuse me. Great, thanks folks. Okay, we have a couple, 2 more. So is anyone already producing at least one product under the California Processed Food Registration Permit? Great, thank you guys. And then this is our last poll for a while. Is anyone currently trying to work through the process of either getting a processed food registration permit and or a cannery license? You've gone on some of the websites or have heard about them, but don't really know where to start, or you're kind of wading into that process. All right, thanks folks for your participation.
So it seems like many of you are interested in learning more about cottage food operations and those foods that you can produce under that type of license. So we'll go through a bit of that in this webinar today. But to give you kind of an overview of the different resources that we've been working to develop, we have 3 different flowcharts that we have been working on over the past few months. One of which we're going to talk about today, which is the one that's highlighted in that box above. That's really an overview of all the different food regulations that would apply both in the state of California and at the federal level for processing of specifically products derived from fruit and vegetable processing. So we're not going to get into any meat processing, milk processing, that type of thing with these materials. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're also working to develop some flowcharts specifically for individuals that are interested in pursuing a California processed food registration and also a California cannery license. It seems like that might not be of much interest for this group, but keep your eyes on your email inbox because we're planning to host some webinars to go through those flowcharts as well in the future. So as I mentioned, just again, kind of as a disclaimer, so these resources are not going to cover the processing of dairy products or meat products. So if you're interested in making cheeses or any type of charcuterie or other meat product, that's really not within the scope of the resources that we've developed. We're really focused here on foods that are derived from fruit and vegetable commodities and further processed into jams and jellies, for example, any dried fruit or nut product. We're going to cover the regulations that would apply to making acidified pickles, salsas, canned fruits, and canned vegetables. So again, those are really what we're focusing on here. If you're interested in dairy or meat processing, feel free to contact me offline via email or phone, and we can discuss what some of those regulatory hurdles would be for those types of products. All right, so as you're, kind of thinking about getting into the food processing business, I think one of the really important things to think about in the beginning is that different types of processed foods inherently have different levels of risk. And so as you go from what's considered a low risk type of processed food to a high risk type of processed food, you're going to have increasing numbers of food regulations that are going to apply to the production of those type of products. So here in this slide, we're giving some examples of what would be considered low-risk foods and all the way up the spectrum to what would be considered a high-risk type of foods. So I'll start on the left-hand side with the low-risk foods. So these foods are considered low risk because, number one, these foods don't support the growth of the bacteria Clostridium botulinum, which, if it grows in foods, can produce a toxin called botulism toxin that can be fatal to humans if ingested. So that's really one of the important criteria that helps designate whether or not that product is low risk or high risk. It's whether or not that food can support the growth of Clostridium botulinum. So those low-risk foods on the list, like honey, nut mixes, popcorn, those would all be products that are not favorable for the growth of that microorganism. They don't have water available, for example. They're very dry products, so they would not be able to support the growth of that bacteria, and therefore we wouldn't have toxin production in those food products. Fruit-based jams and jellies are also on our low-risk food list. So we're going to talk about what is an acidic food versus a low-acid food product. So the acidity level in the food is really critical, because if we have a food product that's very high in acid, that high acid level will inhibit the growth of Clostridium botulinum in that food product. So if we have a very high acid starting food material, like most fruits, they're very high in acid, those are going to be considered low risk, because that acidity level is going to inhibit growth of Clostridium botulinum and inhibit toxin production. Also, any dried or dehydrated whole fruit and vegetable is also considered low risk. Again, we're pulling all the moisture out of those products, so those aren't going to be susceptible to that bacteria growing and producing toxin. You'll see here we've designated specifically whole vegetables and fruits. Once you start chopping those fruits and vegetables, that increases the risk associated with production. So if you do have any chopping prior to dehydration, that would actually move up the food safety spectrum into that medium risk category. So in general, foods that are on our low risk list are going to fall under the Cottage Food Law. And so the Cottage Food Law, it allows you to produce certain types of low-risk foods in your home kitchen and sell those commercially if you are having annual sales of that product that's less than $50,000 per year. So the Cottage Food Law actually has a very prescriptive list of what types of foods you can produce in a cottage food operation. There's now 33 foods on that list. And so we have some links that we'll provide to you guys that can help you navigate to that list, so you can see whether or not the product you're interested in producing falls on that cottage food list or not. So when we move up the food safety spectrum, kind of in this medium risk category, fall things like oil. So olive oil, if you're interested in producing olive oil, that's considered kind of this medium risk type of food processing. Canned tomatoes, canned fruits, and any of the low-risk foods on that low-risk foods list, if you're producing more or selling more than $50,000 a year of those products, and therefore would not be able to fall under the Cottage Food Law, you kind of move up into this medium category where you'd have to produce those food products under the processed food registration under the state of California. So kind of moving up this list, we have more regulations that apply. A lot of questions come up regarding fermented foods. So fermented foods in California can be produced under a processed food registration, or a PFR, as you'll hear us refer to it. So you cannot produce fermented foods under a cottage food license. Those types of food products have to be produced under a processed food registration. And then if we go all the way over to the right to our highest risk types of foods, so these are foods that would potentially be susceptible to Clostridium botulinum growing in these types of products and producing toxin. So things like canned salsas, hot sauces, vinegar pickled vegetables are what we call acidified foods. So these are initially ingredients. So the vegetables that are the base ingredients are low in acid content. So we're typically adding some type of vinegar or citrus juice to these products, which will increase the acidity level in the final product. But as you can imagine, if we deviate from that level of vinegar or lemon juice that we're adding to that recipe, we might not get an adequate level of acid in that product to protect against Clostridium botulinum. So therefore, the federal government and our state government has much more regulatory oversight over the production of those types of products. So there's actually a specific federal regulation, the acidified food regulation, that applies to the production of vinegar pickled vegetables, for example. And then in the state of California, you'll also have to go through the California Cannery Licensing Program that will require you to give the state information on the actual formulation of your product. So how much acid you're adding, how much base vegetable you're adding in your process. And they're actually going to inspect your facility on a regular basis and also inspect every batch of product that you make in that facility prior to that product going out into commerce. So they want to make sure that you are in fact following the procedure that you laid out for making those pickles exactly, to make sure there's no risk, food safety risk in that product if it's released into market. And then things like canned vegetables, so canned green beans, canned carrots, for example. These are also high-risk types of foods. So here we have a product that is low in acid, so it is susceptible to Clostridium botulinum growth and toxin production if it's not processed properly. So there is a separate federal regulation for the production of these low-acid canned food products. And also in California, you're going to have to apply for that cannery license as well. And in this case, there's actually even more scrutiny on your process even than some of the acidified foods. So if you're planning to can vegetables, for example, you would have to provide information to the state related to the size of can or jar you're going to use, the time and temperature that you're going to be processing those canned vegetables. So there's a lot more legwork involved on your side to get some of those products to market as well.
And just to be clear, Erin, you're when you're saying canned vegetables, for the audience, these are not canned pickled vegetables. So if you're doing like dilly beans, beans are a vegetable, but that would be a vinegar pickled vegetable.
Exactly. Okay, so this is, again, think about those lists of foods we talked about and their risk. So on the far left, if we had a low risk food, those are going to have the fewest number of regulations that apply in terms of production. So most of those low risk foods that I gave as examples are going to fall under the Cottage Food Law. So you would be able to produce those types of foods in your home kitchen if your annual sales were less than $50,000. Those medium risk foods that we talked about, like olive oil, those would require a processed food registration permit in the state of California. If you are producing organic, you would also have to apply for an organic processed food registration permit with the state of California. And then you would also have to adhere to some other federal regulations. So the FDA has specific labeling requirements that apply to all processed foods produced in the United States. So you would have to follow those FDA labeling requirements. There's also a new FDA regulation, the Food Safety Modernization Act, which Kaylee's going to talk about in a little bit, and that might apply to your business. However, there are some exemptions based on the size of your business. When we go over to the far right, where we have our high risk types of food, there's many regulations that apply. So you'd still have to adhere to the FDA labeling requirements, the Food Safety Modernization Act requirements, if those apply based on the size of your business. But then you're also going to have to adhere to the California Cannery Licensing Program. On that list is preventive controls rules. So that's the Food Safety Modernization Act. That might apply if you're producing a vinegar pickle. You'd have to be compliant with the acidified food regulation. And if you're canning a vegetable where you're not adding any vinegar or acid, you'd have to be compliant with the low acid canned food regulation. So as I'm sure you can kind of infer, the more regulations you have to adhere to, the higher the cost. So there are fees associated with registering for the state. And so those fees tend to increase kind of the higher you get up in that risk spectrum. And of course, your operating costs are going to be much higher if you have a high risk food compared to a low risk food. So all things to consider as you're thinking about entering the food processing space.
Thanks a lot, Erin, for walking us through all of that. That's a lot. So here is a different kind of visual layout of a lot of what Erin just mentioned in one way or another. So at the local level in California, we have some regulations that are enforced by our county environmental health department, and mainly that is the cottage food operators permit if you are doing that and are making products that fit that criteria. And then there's some other county or local level regulations that deal with temporary food permits and et cetera that you can see there. Then at the state level, we have those three that we've mentioned, the PFR and the cannery license, and then also many of the federal regulations are actually enforced at the state level. So for example, the Food Safety Modernization Act, the preventative controls rule for that in California, the California Department of Public Health is doing the enforcement for the most part in California. It doesn't mean FDA couldn't show up if they wanted to a facility to inspect them, but the Department of Public Health is mainly doing that. So a little tiny bit on the Food Safety Modernization Act, or it's often referred to as FSMA. So FSMA was put into law in 2011, signed by President Obama, and it was the first overhaul to our federal food safety regulations in over 70 years, and it applies to the whole supply chain here. So for the fresh raw produce at the farm, there's parts of the law that apply to that. For facilities, processing and manufacturing, there's parts of FSMA that apply to that. Transportation, importing, all sorts of as parts of the law have different rules or sections that in FSMA that relate to them. So when you're talking about processing or manufacturing food, you're most likely going to fall under the preventative controls rule for human food, or it's often referred to as the PC rule. And so that's one part or one rule under FSMA, and it's called the PC rule. And it has various requirements depending upon the type of food or size of the business. And we're going to dive into that a little bit further because there are different modifications for some scenarios. So here is this flow chart we keep mentioning on the right-hand side of the screen. We know that's super overwhelming and really small font and don't expect you to be able to read any of that, but that's just a big picture overview visual so you can see. And we're gonna work through a couple of examples here now to take apart small pieces of this flow chart at once and look at it. So let's work through this. So this flowchart is intended to help folks answer these questions. Does your product require compliance with any federal regulations? And secondly, does your product require compliance with any California state regulations? So while it may be, folks might be more interested in say like, just tell me what I need to do for my lemon curd or my chili pepper jam or whatever the product might be. There's so many products out there and folks are so creative and have all these different products that it makes more sense for us to create more of a structure and foundation with this flow chart to help guide you through no matter what your product, except for, as Erin mentioned, meat products and dairy we don't have the applicable USDA and other regulations for those in this, but for the most part, fruit and vegetable processed products, this is a good place to start with this flow chart. So let's work through a couple examples. Our first example here is canned tomato sauce, and the ingredients are very simple. It's just tomatoes from the farm and a little bit of purchased salt. And how these canned tomatoes are processed is that they're made in an on-farm kitchen that's up to code. And when these canned jars are complete, they're stored in an area that's within an enclosed packing area at the same farm, at the same location. So if you start at the flow chart and you start at the top, the first question is, are you washing, packing, and or labeling raw agricultural commodities or racks? Or are you manipulating the ripening of racks? So we're not doing that. We're canning these tomatoes. So the answer is no there. So no, I also conduct other types of processing activities. And that leads you to the second question, which is, are you only making juice? And in our example, no, we're not. We're making a canned roasted tomato product. So we're no for both of those. And you can see there that what the yes would lead you to and some explanation there. And we tried to make this flowchart as minimally jumbled with words as possible, but there's a lot of information out there. So we have a number of hyperlinks and footnotes here that you can see with these numbers. And there's a long list of supplementary resources that we highly encourage you to reference after this, because we can't dive deep into explaining the details of all these different kind of lingo and words and phrases and so many acronyms. Okay, so we answered no. And so that leads us to this question. Is your process limited to dehydrating uncut produce or another low-risk activity? So this question is aimed at trying to determine if the product you're making would fit into the California Cottage Food Law. So processing canned tomatoes is not one of the listed 33 products you can make on the Cottage Food Law list. And if you follow the link here for the 3 for low risk, it'll take you to what the Cottage Food Law determines as low risk. So the answer is no, but hypothetically, if you were to say yes, you can see here that it leads you through a few different questions where it asks you if the food is on the approved cottage food list, and it asks, as Erin's mentioned, if your sales of that product are less than $50,000, and if you meet customer requirements. So customer requirements is explained further at that link there, but it mainly means you have to be selling either directly to customers, or you can sell through a few numbers of intermediary pathways, like if you sold to a restaurant or a local grocery store, but you couldn't be selling your cottage food product on the wholesale level or anything like that. But look into that more with those resources if you think the Cottage Food Law might apply to your product. Okay, but to shift back over, our answer is no, we're not processing a low-risk activity. So that has us jump to this box where it says, is the product you're making considered low risk? Here again, you say, well, I don't know, is it low risk? So for the processed food registration permit, low risk products would be products that have ingredients in them where the food naturally has a pH that is 4.6 or lower. So simply put, these are products that are naturally high acid products, as Erin mentioned earlier. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but the higher the acid, the lower on the pH scale that product would be. So tomatoes are naturally kind of right around 4.6 or so or lower. And so if you're only making a product that has tomatoes in it, that is allowed to be made under the processed food registration permit. So that's considered a low risk product, and you would say yes here, and that yes arrow leads you to The answer, your value-added product requires a PFR. And then if you are going to make an organic product, there's this side box here that says that you need to submit the organic PFR as well. So these are kind of where the dead ends for state level regulations are, and both of these have these black arrows that lead to the second part of the flow chart that takes you through the federal regulations. So we got the answer for the state level. Our tomatoes need to get a PFR. And now at the federal level, do you process your products in a facility that is classified as a retail food establishment? So, perfectly logical question, what is a retail food establishment? Well, a retail food establishment is an establishment that sells food products directly to consumers as its primary function. Additionally, retail food establishments can also include grocery stores, convenience stores, and vending machine locations. In sum, these are businesses that are making food, including farm businesses, with at least 50.1% of that food being sold directly to individual consumers. So there is the chance that a farm making the product in their own coded, up to code kitchen that has a PFR, and they're selling those canned tomatoes, the majority of them, directly to customers that you would be able to say, in our example here, as we mentioned, that they're making and storing this product on site, and I should have also put on that slide that how they're selling it. But I'm telling you right now, they're selling it directly to customers. Just when people come to their farm stand or in their CSA, their community supported agriculture boxes. So they would be able to say yes, and then that box tells you that this business is not required to register with the FDA, and the PC rule, or the preventative controls rule, does not apply. So FSMA directed the FDA to modify the definition of the retail food establishment to state very clearly that a retail food establishment also includes certain farm-operated businesses selling food directly to consumers as their primary function. And as I mentioned, this means that farms that are processing farm products into value-added products and selling the majority of those directly to customers do not have to register. So there's a lot of very detailed parts to this, and I know we're going through this pretty fast, but we have another example that follows a different path through this process. So I'm going to turn it over to Erin and have her walk through that. Let me just check really quick to make sure we don't have any clarifying questions on what we just went through. No, we have a question on something else, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And for time's sake, we'll switch over to Erin walking through her example.
All right, so previous example, we were talking about canned tomato sauce. Now we're going to transition and talk about canned salsa. So our ingredients here are tomatoes, peppers, onion, and garlic that we grew on the farm and then purchased, salt, and organic apple cider vinegar. So as Kaylee mentioned, tomatoes are a naturally acidic food product, but they're right on that borderline between what we call an acidic food and a low acid food product, so right on that pH 4.6 border. But in this product, we're adding peppers, onions, and garlic. So peppers, onions, and garlic are naturally low acid foods. So they have a pH that's above 4.6. So when we mix all of these ingredients together, the salsa itself is going to be what we consider low in acid, so have a pH above 4.6. So in this example, we're going to acidify our salsa by adding the vinegar. So vinegar, of course, is highly acidic, so we can add vinegar to that mixture of tomatoes, peppers, onion, and garlic and bring the acidity level up or the pH down, however you want to think about it. And therefore, we have an acidified food product on our hands. So if we happen to not add the right amount of vinegar to our salsa, we could have a very risky product on our hands. So we're making our salsa in a kitchen that's not on the farm. It's a rented space in a commercial kitchen that's in town. And then we're storing our salsa in a room within an enclosed packing house. So we're actually storing the salsa in a different location from where we're producing it, which will be important as we work through this flow chart. So let's get started. So we're going to start at the same spot. So I'm not going to go through these boxes too much in detail, but here we're not washing, packing, or labeling racks or manipulating their ripening. So we're going to answer no. We also conduct other types of processing activities. Are we only making juice? No, we're not. We're making salsa. So we're going to move down to our next box. Which is your process limited to dehydrating uncut produce or another low-risk activity? So in this case, again, we're making an acidified food product, which is considered high risk. So we would answer no on this box here. It's salsa is not going to be a food that's on our approved cottage food list. It's actually, as I mentioned, considered a high-risk food. So we'll answer no here. And move down to the next box, which would be, is the product you're making considered low risk, and would it require production under the processed food registration with the California Department of Public Health? Again, we're making this acidified food product that's higher risk, so we're going to answer no to that question there and move down to the next box where we have high-risk products require both a CDPH cannery license and or a California Department of Public Health processed food registration. So in our case, we're making a salsa. So production of that salsa as an acidified food would require the cannery license. So in this example, we'd have to have a cannery license in that commercial kitchen where we're producing the salsa. But we're also storing that salsa on our farm. And so that room in our packing house where we're storing that canned product would be required to have a processed food registration with the California Department of Public Health. So the PFR applies not only to processing of those low-risk food types, but also for facilities where you're holding a food product. So in this example, we need the cannery license for the production facility for the salsa and the PFR for the facility where we're storing that salsa. So now we're going to move down to the federal regulations. So we'd be in that center box. Again, the question, do you process your products in a facility that is classified as a retail food establishment? We're making our salsa in a commercial kitchen in this example, so that is not considered a retail food establishment. So we'd have to answer no to that question, which would then push us over to the box with the question, do you have less than $1,079,963 in annual sales? So this question is actually related to the Food Safety Modernization Act Preventive Controls Rule for Human Food. So in that regulation, they realized that there was a lot of financial regulatory burden for food processors written in this regulation. So they determined a business size threshold, which if you fall under that threshold, in this case, less than this level of annual sales, then you would qualify for what's called a qualified facility exemption. So there's different parts of the regulation that if you have less than that level in annual sales that you would be exempt from. So in this case, we do have less than that level of annual sales of our salsa. So that's going to lead us over to another box. Are your on-farm processing activities considered low risk by the FDA? So the FDA has identified a list a list of low-risk food activity combinations. So if you're conducting any of these combinations on your farm, you may be exempt from the preventive controls rule in its entirety. So I'll just go through what some of those examples are so you're aware. I will say this is not a very large list of activities. It's very prescriptive what the FDA says you're allowed to do on farm as a low risk activity. But just for an example, you can boil gums, latexes, and resins. You can chop, core, cut, peel, shred, slice acid fruits and vegetables that have a pH less than 4.2. So that would be things like citrus. They have a very low pH. You could cut and core those on your farm and be exempt from the preventive controls rule. You can coat dried dehydrated fruits and vegetables. You can dry or dehydrate fruits, vegetables that have a pH less than 4.2. So yeah, there's not a whole lot on this list for what you're allowed to do in terms of processing on your farm. But if you are going to be establishing your food processing business on your farm, it would be really important to go through this list in detail, see if what you're aiming to do is on this list that would be exempt from the PC rule, because that will save you from having to be compliant with two parts of the Food Safety Modernization Act. In our case for the salsa, producing an acidified food is not on the low risk list for the FDA.
And just to jump in really quick, this footnote number 10 here, that links you to a National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition excellent guide about this rule, and they have a really well laid out table in there that's a couple pages long that goes through some of these examples Erin just mentioned, but the whole list in its entirety. So if you're wondering where can I find this list, check out that resource there.
Perfect. And they have a lot of great FSMA related resources in general, but certainly if you're interested in finding out whether or not your on-farm processing is considered low risk, that's a great resource to refer to. So since we are not on that low risk list, we answer no to that question and move over to the next question in the flow chart. Do you have less than 500 employees in your business? And yes, we're a very small producer of salsa, so we have far less than 500 employees. So that leads us down to this box. You are a qualified facility under the preventive controls rule for human food and are exempt from a portion of the regulation. You're still required to register with FDA and submit certain attestations about your business's food safety practices. So I know that sounds like a lot. But just to give you, kind of a general sense of what you would still have to be compliant with, there's what's called good manufacturing practices for all food processing facilities, which are basically, they have outlined requirements for employee health and hygiene, requiring your employees to wash their hands and not come to work when they're sick. There's general sanitation requirements, so how you're going to clean your food processing facility and that type of thing. So you would still be required to be compliant with those general good manufacturing practices, but you wouldn't necessarily have to go through the further steps in preventive controls rule implementation for your food processing establishment. I will say in this example, since we are producing an acidified food product, you'd still have to be compliant with the state cannery license program and the federal regulations that apply to the production of acidified foods. So there's a specific class that's required for those that are producing acidified foods. There's also specific filings you have to make with the state and the FDA. But in general, for FSMA and the preventive controls rule, you would have to file with the FDA and then make sure that you file attestations that give information that you do have less than those $1 million in annual sales less than 500 employees, and that you have done a general assessment of the food safety hazards in your facility, and that you're adequately addressing those hazards. So that's just to give you kind of an overview of how you would utilize this particular flow chart. Again, there's many nuances in these regulations and how they apply, but our goal here was to really, give kind of a general resource that you could refer to and figure out where would be your starting point. Are you going to be a cottage food operation? Are you going to be kind of the next step up and have the processed food registration in the state of California? And then we also wanted to make sure that we included some of those applicable federal regulations as well. So we just want to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of some of the other resources that we're working on as part of this project. So you see up on your screen now a timeline for the processed food registration. So for both the PFR and the cannery license, we tried to lay out a timeline that would outline the different filings that you would have to do with the state, the different training requirements that you would have to go through yourself as a producer of these types of products, and then give you just a sense of the amount of time that it takes to go through some of these steps. So it's not going to be something that you can do overnight. These filings and the process do take a lot of time. So if you're interested in either the PFR or the cannery license, we're working on the final drafts of these resources right now. And then as those come out, we will be also offering a webinar to walk through those resources. So again, look for those coming through your inbox in the near future. So we also have many other resources that we feel are very, very helpful for newcomers to food processing and those starting out in the food business. So the California Department of Food and Ag Small Farm Food Safety Guidelines are very, very useful. There's a lot of information there on starting your food processing business. The UC Davis Food Safety website is hosted by myself and a few other extension individuals working in the food safety space. So there's information there related to on-farm food safety, issues and regulatory compliance guidances for food processors as well. And then there's just general information for consumers related to food safety. CAF's webpage has a lot of wonderful resources related to on-farm food safety and processing as well. They have a lot of up-to-date information related to FSMA and some of the nuances of these new food regulations as they apply to growers. So I encourage you to check out all of those websites and peruse the resources that are available there. We're also referring you here to the California Department of Public Health Food and Drug Branch website, which has very detailed information on cottage food operations. So you can actually find the law itself linked to at their website, as well as that list of the foods that are approved cottage foods on their website. They have information there on the processed food registration, so some background information, and then also links to all the forms that are required for filing for that PFR permit. And as well for the cannery license, there's some background information there, why they have this program to begin with, and then also some links to forms and filings required for obtaining that cannery license in California.
Wow, thanks a lot, Erin, for walking us through that more detailed and complicated example. So now we want to take a moment, and we recognize we've got about 5 minutes left. So we have a couple more audience questions right now, and then we will open it up, a couple more audience poll questions that we want to ask you all. And then we have received a couple questions right now, but if folks have other questions, I encourage you to start typing those into the the question box now, and I'm going to activate the couple poll questions while we go through that. So just to circle back to our first question here for folks. So now, after walking through this flowchart and talking about this for the last hour, if you could rate now, an hour later, your current knowledge level post talking about this, about the cottage food regulations permit or the CFO permit. How do you feel about your knowledge about it now? All right, thanks a lot for your participation. And then we just are going to go through the same questions from the beginning about, so your current knowledge level about the PFR, the Processed Food Registration Permit in California, what we needed to get with our tomato example and also with our salsa example, because we were storing our salsa in a different location than the kitchen we were making it. How do folks feel about your knowledge about the PFR? Great, thank you. And then two more. So this one is the same question, but for the cannery license, and we needed this for the salsa example because salsa is considered a higher risk product, and the kitchen or the production facility where the salsa is made needs to make sure to have the cannery license. Okay, great. And then last poll question here. So this one is your knowledge about the FSMA preventative controls rule. So this was in the bottom part of the flow chart, and how, depending upon, some people or operations are fully exempt from this rule if they meet the retail food establishment. In some situations, some businesses get the qualified exemption, like our salsa. And then some other bigger operations, they're deemed too big. No matter what types of products they're making, they need to be in full compliance. So I'll give us a second longer here. All right, great. Thanks to you all for your participation on that. Let me flip back to the slides if I can figure out that. Okay. So that just leads us to questions. So again, I encourage anybody to add any questions here. So we have one about, would herbal teas made from dried but not heat or otherwise processed herbal materials and flowers be covered as dried whole veg and fruit under the cottage food operation list, is what I'm guessing you're getting at there. And my first instinct would say yes, because I don't know exactly what you're doing, but I'm guessing you're taking one cut at harvest to cut that stalk of whatever it is, of chamomile or whatever from the ground, and then you're drying that, and then you're pulling off the petals or whatever, the organic matter, to create your tea. So that would be my response, Erin.
I would agree with that. I think it's important to note here that the drying activity has to be in your home kitchen. I get a lot of questions about people that are interested in drying fruits and vegetables, say in a barn that they have on site, and so it's required that the actual manipulation of the food, the drying, or if you're happen to be making a baked good, that happens in your home kitchen. It can't be a separate kitchen or facility. It has to be your home kitchen.
Okay, great. And then we have another question. What about frozen or bagged fruits and vegetables? So kind of two questions here. So frozen fruits or vegetables, That would be a processing activity that would be under the processed food registration permit, because you are processing or manufacturing a product. And while someone might think that, oh, freezing it, that's like a kill step, or like processing it in a way that we don't need to worry so much about food safety, that's not really true. And you still need to get the processed food registration permit at the state level. And then as far as the PC rule, that would it would matter how you're selling it when you walk through that part of the flow chart. So would you qualify for the retail food establishment based on how you're selling it? I'm guessing probably not, because there's not a ton of like frozen food sold directly to customers. You're probably maybe selling it to a bigger buyer or something. So I guess my quick answer would be that. I don't know if you have others to add, Erin.
Yeah, so most of our, most refrigerated and frozen product, well, all are going to be able to be produced under the processed food registration. But kind of like Kaylee said, where you fall in terms of the federal regulations and FSMA would depend on some of those other details.
So I don't think there's any other questions being typed in at this point. So I'm just going to flip to this screen just in case folks want to take down any of our contact information. We're more than happy to do our best to answer any additional questions post-webinar here. And I see that we're out of time as well, but we're happy to stick on the webinar for another minute or so. If anyone's got a question that they just want to type in quick here, we can do that, but recognize if folks need to get off for your time's sake. Just a little logistical note, we will be sending out an email post-webinar, probably tomorrow or the next day, that'll have the PDF of the flowchart, this slideshow, and hopefully the recording in it. If not, the recording will be posted on the UC Davis Food Safety website and the CAF website in the near future. So it'll be available. And thank you all for your time today, and hope that this was able to be an opportunity to answer some questions and clear up a little bit of this, we know, very complicated regulatory puzzle of working through all of these different layers of various regulations. So I guess that's all on our end.
Yeah, thank you all for being on the webinar today. Again, if you have any questions, we're easy to contact via email or phone, so please do reach out.
All right, thanks everybody, and have a beautiful rest of your day.